Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The cruelest betrayals never happen behind closed doors. They happen where everyone is watching. The grand ballroom of the Windsor Grand Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every table dressed in ivory linen and fresh white roses. Every guest wearing their finest evening attire as a string quartet filled the room with gentle music. It was supposed to be the happiest afternoon of Maren Whitlock's life. She stood quietly behind the closed doors leading to the ceremony, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the elegant satin gown she had spent nearly a year dreaming about. Her father had passed away when she was in college. Her mother had worked double shifts to help pay tuition, and every small detail of this wedding had been earned through patience instead of privilege. Today wasn't just about marrying the man she loved. It was proof that every difficult year had finally led somewhere beautiful. Her maid of honor squeezed her hand. "You ready?" Maren smiled through nervous eyes. "More than ready." The wedding coordinator nodded, signaling it was time. The heavy doors slowly opened as sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, casting warm colors across the polished marble floor. Every guest rose together. Heads turned toward her. Soft whispers floated through the room. She barely noticed any of it because all she could see was the man waiting at the altar. Daniel Mercer looked as confident as ever in his tailored tuxedo, his expression unreadable beneath the bright lights. For 4 years she had believed he was her future. They had built plans together, toured neighborhoods looking for their first home, talked about family vacations, children, and quiet Sunday mornings. She walked toward him one measured step at a time, her heartbeat louder than the orchestra. Halfway down the aisle, she noticed something strange. Daniel wasn't smiling. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't looking at her the way every groom looked at his bride. Instead, his eyes kept drifting toward someone seated near the front row. Lydia, his executive assistant. Maren felt a faint chill crawl across her shoulders despite the warm afternoon. Maybe she was imagining it. Weddings made everyone emotional. Maybe he was simply overwhelmed. She kept walking until she finally stood across from him. The officiant welcomed everyone and began speaking about commitment, trust, and choosing one person every single day. Maren reached for Daniel's hands. He didn't take them. Instead, he stepped backward. A quiet murmur spread through the room. The officiant stopped speaking. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "I can't do this." At first, Maren laughed softly, assuming it was an awkward joke fueled by nerves. "Daniel," she whispered. "Everyone's waiting." He slowly shook his head. "No, they deserve the truth." The room became so quiet that even the musicians lowered their instruments. Every guest stared without moving. Maren searched his face for confusion, fear, anything that could explain what was happening. Instead, she found certainty. Cold, unwavering certainty. Daniel turned toward the front row. "Lydia," he called gently. The young woman looked frozen in her chair before reluctantly standing. Daniel walked away from the altar, away from Maren, and stopped beside his assistant. He reached for Lydia's trembling hand. Gasps rippled across the ballroom like a wave. "I've spent too long pretending," Daniel continued. "The person I truly love is standing right here." Maren's breath caught in her throat. The bouquet slipped slightly in her fingers, but she refused to let it fall. Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the whispers spreading through the guests. Some looked away in embarrassment. Others stared openly, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Her mother covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Maren wanted to speak. She wanted to ask why. She wanted to understand how 4 years could disappear in less than a minute. But no words came. Daniel never looked back at her. Instead, he guided Lydia toward the aisle as though the ceremony had simply changed direction. Reporters near the entrance immediately reached for their phones. Camera flashes lit the ballroom. A lifetime of memories collapsed beneath the weight of public humiliation. Maren remained standing alone before the altar, still wearing the engagement ring that suddenly felt heavier than stone. Then, from the very last row, a chair quietly slid across the floor. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit rose to his feet. Every executive in the room recognized him instantly, and Daniel's expression changed for the first time that afternoon. Confidence vanished from his face. Standing silently beneath the chandelier was Callum Ashford, the billionaire founder of Ashford Global and Daniel Mercer's most powerful business rival. The silence inside the ballroom lingered long after Daniel and Lydia disappeared through the towering entrance, leaving behind hundreds of stunned guests who no longer knew where to look. Some whispered behind raised champagne glasses, while others quietly slipped toward the exits, eager to become the first to tell the story that would dominate every business luncheon and social gathering for weeks. Marin remained motionless, her fingers still wrapped around the bouquet that no longer meant anything. She could hear the clicking of expensive shoes against the marble floor, the rustling of formal gowns, even the distant sound of photographers chasing the scandal outside. Yet everything felt strangely muted, as if the world had suddenly moved underwater. Then a calm voice broke through the haze. "Miss Whitlock." She slowly turned. Callum Ashford stood only a few feet away. Up close, he looked nothing like the ruthless corporate titan described in financial magazines. His expression held no amusement, no pity, and certainly no satisfaction. There was only quiet respect. "Your car is blocked by the media," he said gently. "I have a private exit if you would like to avoid them." Marin stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Why would you help me?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Because today has already taken enough from you." She hesitated, then nodded once. Together they walked through a narrow service hallway lined with polished steel doors instead of flowers and decorations. The distant noise of reporters faded behind thick concrete walls until only the sound of their footsteps remained. Neither of them spoke again until they reached a quiet underground parking garage where a sleek black SUV waited beside a private elevator. The driver opened the rear door, but Callum remained standing outside. "I can have you taken anywhere you would like," he said. Marin looked down at her wedding dress. The satin fabric that had seemed so beautiful only an hour earlier now felt like a costume she desperately wanted to escape. "Home," she whispered. Actually, she stopped herself. There was no home waiting. The apartment she had shared with Daniel was in his name. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, every carefully planned future belonged to a life that no longer existed. Her eyes slowly filled with tears she had fought so hard to hide. "I do not know where to go." Callum did not ask questions. He simply nodded toward the vehicle. "There is a guest suite at one of my properties. Stay there tonight. No obligations. No expectations. Leave whenever you are ready." Marin instinctively shook her head. "I cannot accept charity." "It is not charity," he answered. "It is privacy." She studied his face, searching for hidden motives, but found nothing except sincerity. Exhaustion finally outweighed pride. She quietly stepped into the vehicle. The drive across downtown Chicago passed in near silence as late afternoon sunlight reflected across towering glass buildings. Marin watched familiar streets drift by through the tinted window, wondering how a single afternoon had erased 4 years of certainty. After nearly 30 minutes, the SUV entered the gates of a secluded lakeside estate surrounded by towering oak trees instead of flashing cameras. Inside, the home felt elegant without being overwhelming. Warm lighting softened the modern architecture, and fresh flowers rested on a simple wooden table near the entrance. Nothing about the house seemed designed to impress. Instead, it felt peaceful. A housekeeper greeted them with a warm smile before quietly disappearing to prepare a room. Marin finally looked toward Callum. "I still do not understand why you are doing this." He paused before answering. "Because I know what public humiliation costs. It follows people long after the headlines disappear." That answer lingered in her mind. It sounded less like sympathy and more like experience. Later that evening, after changing into comfortable clothes provided by the house staff, Marin stepped onto a quiet terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. The water reflected the fading orange sky, while cool summer air carried the scent of cedar trees across the property. She wrapped a light sweater around her shoulders as she heard footsteps behind her. Callum joined her without interrupting the silence. After several moments he spoke. "Tomorrow, every business network in America will replay what happened." Marin closed her eyes. "I know. Daniel believes today made him stronger." She looked toward him. "Did it?" Callum's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "No. Today revealed exactly who he has always been." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a slim cream-colored envelope, placing it carefully on the terrace table between them. "I did not come to your wedding for this," he said quietly. "But after everything I witnessed, I believe there may be a way for both of us to protect what matters most." Marin glanced at the unopened envelope, her heartbeat quickening as she slowly realized this conversation was about to change her life all over again. Marin lowered her eyes toward the cream-colored envelope resting on the table as the evening breeze carried gentle ripples across Lake Michigan. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, wondering how one ordinary piece of paper suddenly felt heavier than the engagement ring she had removed only an hour earlier. Finally, she reached forward and carefully opened it. Inside was a neatly prepared agreement, only a few pages long, along with a single business card bearing Callum Ashford's name beneath the words founder and chairman of Ashford Global. She looked up at him with quiet confusion. "A contract?" she asked softly. Callum nodded once. "A proposal?" Marin almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because the day had become too unbelievable to process. "I already accepted one promise that destroyed my life." Callum did not react defensively. Instead, he folded his hands calmly in front of him. "Then allow me to explain every word before you decide." She remained silent. "Within 3 weeks, my company will complete the largest merger in its history," he continued. "The board, our investors, and several international partners have become increasingly concerned about my personal life. They believe a stable family image strengthens long-term leadership. Normally, I would ignore those opinions, but this merger affects thousands of employees." Marin listened carefully without interrupting. "Your wedding today has created another problem," Callum said. "Every news outlet is already portraying you as the woman who was abandoned at the altar. By tomorrow morning, reporters will follow you everywhere. Recruiters will hesitate to hire you because they will fear unwanted publicity. Your professional reputation will unfairly become part of someone else's scandal." She hated how accurate his words sounded. Even now, she could imagine endless headlines replaying the worst moment of her life. "So what exactly are you suggesting?" she finally asked. Callum met her eyes without hesitation. "Marry me." The words settled quietly between them. There was no dramatic music, no grand declaration, only honesty. Marin blinked several times before shaking her head. "You cannot possibly be serious." "I have never been more serious." She stood and slowly walked toward the stone railing overlooking the dark water. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She turned sharply. "No, you do not." Callum remained where he was. "I know you spent years building a design business instead of depending on Daniel's money. I know you stayed beside your mother through every medical appointment after her surgery. I know every employee at Mercer Development described you as the kindest person in the building." Marin frowned. "How could you know those things?" "Because business rivals pay attention." She stared at him, uncertain whether to feel uncomfortable or strangely understood. Callum stepped closer, leaving enough distance to respect her space. "This would be a legal agreement lasting 1 year. Separate bedrooms. Separate finances. Complete respect for your independence. You may continue your career exactly as you choose. If after 1 year either of us wishes to end the marriage, we quietly divorce with no public conflict." Marin looked back at the contract. "And if I say no? Then tomorrow morning my driver will take you anywhere you wish, and we never discuss this again." There was no pressure in his voice, only certainty that the decision belonged entirely to her. She slowly returned to the table and continued reading. The agreement was surprisingly simple. No hidden penalties. No unreasonable demands. One clause immediately caught her attention. Neither party shall interfere with the personal dignity, career, or future happiness of the other. She looked up again. "You wrote this?" Callum nodded. "It is the only condition that mattered to me." She felt something shift inside her. Daniel had spent years asking what benefited him. Callum's first written promise was protecting her dignity. The difference was impossible to ignore. "What do you gain besides a better public image?" she asked quietly. For the first time that evening, Callum hesitated before answering. "Peace." The single word carried unexpected weight. Before Marin could ask what he meant, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, then silently handed it to her. Every major business network was already broadcasting footage from the failed wedding. Daniel and Lydia stood smiling together outside the hotel while reporters surrounded them. Beneath the video, a breaking headline appeared. Mercer Development announces strategic partnership following surprise wedding scandal. Marin's heart sank as she realized the wedding had never been only about love. It had become part of a calculated business move. Callum quietly took back the phone and looked toward the city lights glowing across the lake. Daniel believes he won today, he said calmly. He has no idea the real game has not even begun. Marin barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ballroom again, the stunned faces of friends, the silence that followed Daniel's confession, and the crushing feeling of standing alone beneath the wedding arch. Just after sunrise, she walked downstairs, expecting the unfamiliar house to feel cold and intimidating. But instead the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread drifted from the kitchen. The housekeeper smiled kindly before placing breakfast on the dining table. "Mr. Ashford leaves for the office early every morning," she explained. "He asked me to tell you there is absolutely no rush. Please make yourself comfortable." Marin thanked her quietly, surprised that Callum had already left without trying to pressure her into making a decision. Beside her coffee rested another cream-colored envelope. This one contained only a handwritten note. "Take all the time you need. No answer is also an answer. Callum." She read the sentence twice before folding it carefully and slipping it into her purse. It was the first promise anyone had made to her in the last 24 hours that did not demand something in return. Later that afternoon, she asked the driver to take her back to the apartment she had once shared with Daniel. News vans were still parked across the street. Reporters lingered outside the building, hoping to catch another emotional headline. The driver stopped 1 block away so she could enter unnoticed through a side entrance. Inside the apartment, everything looked exactly as she had left it the morning before. Wedding gifts remained stacked beside the living room wall. Framed engagement photos still rested on the shelves. Her wedding shoes sat neatly beside the bedroom door. Yet something had changed forever. The apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had never truly existed. She quietly packed only the belongings she had personally purchased over the years. Sketchbooks filled with interior design ideas, family photographs, a faded quilt her mother had sewn, and a small wooden jewelry box containing the engagement ring she no longer wanted. She left everything else behind. As she reached the front door, she noticed a framed photograph of herself and Daniel smiling on a beach vacation. Without anger or bitterness, she simply turned it face down on the table before walking away. By early evening, she returned to the lakeside estate, carrying 2 modest suitcases. Callum had just arrived home from work and was loosening his tie as he entered the foyer. He looked genuinely surprised to see her. "I hope no one bothered you today," he said. "Only memories," she answered with a tired smile. He nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. They shared a simple dinner in the quiet dining room. There were no discussions about contracts or business mergers. Instead, they talked about ordinary things. Marin described how she had fallen in love with interior design after helping her mother repaint their tiny house during high school. Callum admitted he still preferred old hardcover books over digital readers because they reminded him of evenings spent with his grandfather. The conversation felt unexpectedly easy, almost comforting. For the first time since the wedding disaster, Marin caught herself forgetting the headlines waiting outside the estate gates. After dinner, Callum walked her through the guest wing. "This suite is entirely yours," he said. "No one enters without your permission." He opened another door across the hallway. "My room is here." She noticed the distance between them and quietly appreciated the gesture. Every promise in the contract was already becoming reality before she had signed a single page. The following morning, she found Callum in the library reviewing financial reports before sunrise. He looked up as she entered. "Good morning. You really start working this early?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "The company employs more than 30,000 people. They deserve someone who arrives before the problems do." His answer stayed with her. It was not the response of a man obsessed with power. It sounded like someone carrying responsibility. Just then his assistant entered carrying a folder of newspaper clippings. The top headline read, "Ashford refuses to comment on wedding scandal." Another article criticized him for remaining silent despite attending the ceremony. The assistant looked concerned. "Public relations believes we should respond today." Callum closed the folder without reading another page. "Not yet, sir. The media is creating their own narrative." "Let them," he answered calmly. "Truth does not become stronger because it arrives first. It becomes stronger because it arrives complete." Marin watched him with quiet curiosity. Every instinct had warned her never to trust another successful businessman. Yet everything Callum did contradicted the image she had built in her mind. Later that afternoon, she walked alone through the estate gardens until she reached a quiet gazebo overlooking the lake. She removed the engagement ring from her purse one final time, stared at it beneath the afternoon sunlight, then gently placed it inside the wooden jewelry box beside Callum's handwritten note. One promise had ended. Another possibility was waiting. The only question left was whether she had enough courage to believe in promises again. 3 days later, the headlines had begun to fade, but the whispers had not. Every business column in Chicago seemed determined to compare Daniel Mercer and Callum Ashford, turning private heartbreak into public entertainment. Marin tried to ignore them as she settled into the quiet rhythm of the estate. During the mornings, she reviewed design sketches that had been abandoned for months, and in the afternoons, she explored the bright studio overlooking the lake that Callum had quietly offered for her use. He never interrupted her work. Sometimes she realized hours had passed without seeing him because he remained buried inside meetings that stretched from sunrise until evening. Yet every night, no matter how late he returned, he always asked the same simple question. "Did you have a good day?" It was such an ordinary sentence, but after years of conversations revolving around business deals and social appearances, the question felt surprisingly meaningful. One Friday morning, Callum stood in the foyer adjusting the cuff of his navy suit when his assistant approached carrying a tablet with visible concern. "Sir, the Hamilton Foundation Gala is tomorrow night. Mercer Development has confirmed their attendance." Callum accepted the tablet without changing his expression. "We will be there as planned." The assistant hesitated. "There is another issue. Several reporters are already suggesting Miss Whitlock may appear with you." Marin looked up from the staircase, suddenly uncomfortable. "I do not have to go," she said quickly. "I would rather stay out of the headlines." Callum walked toward her with the same calm confidence she had come to recognize. "The decision is yours. If you prefer staying here, no one will question it. And if I go," he smiled gently, "then you attend as someone who has nothing to be ashamed of." Those words lingered in her thoughts throughout the day. She realized she had spent nearly a week hiding because someone else had betrayed her. Why should she continue carrying the weight of Daniel's choices? The following evening, she stepped into the ballroom of the historic Hamilton Hotel, wearing a simple emerald evening gown instead of the elaborate designer dresses many guests had chosen. She preferred elegance over spectacle, and Callum had never suggested otherwise. As they entered together, conversations immediately softened around them. Camera flashes illuminated the marble entrance while reporters called their names from behind velvet ropes. Callum neither hurried nor posed. He simply offered Marin his arm. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She took a steady breath before slipping her hand through his arm. "Ready." They walked inside together with quiet confidence. Throughout the reception, Callum introduced her not as a victim, nor as a companion, but as Marin Whitlock, an extraordinary interior designer. Every introduction reminded people of her profession instead of her heartbreak. She noticed executives asking genuine questions about sustainable design and community housing rather than gossiping about the wedding. Little by little, she began feeling like herself again. Then the atmosphere shifted. Daniel Mercer entered the ballroom beside Lydia, surrounded by photographers eager for another dramatic moment. Daniel noticed Callum immediately. A faint smile crossed his face before he deliberately changed direction and approached their table. "Callum," he said smoothly, "I should have guessed you would enjoy making a public appearance this soon." Callum remained seated. "Good evening, Daniel." Daniel's eyes moved toward Marin. "I hope you are doing well." His tone sounded polite, but beneath it lingered unmistakable arrogance. "It must be difficult adjusting after everything." Marin answered calmly. "I am adjusting just fine." Daniel chuckled softly. "I always admired your optimism." Before she could respond, Lydia leaned closer with a rehearsed smile. "We never had the chance to properly apologize." Marin looked at both of them without anger. Apologies usually come before people schedule magazine interviews. Lydia's smile disappeared. Several nearby guests quietly pretended not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Daniel straightened his jacket. Business requires difficult decisions. Callum finally stood. He was only slightly taller than Daniel, yet his quiet composure somehow filled the entire space. "No," he replied evenly. "Business requires integrity. What you are describing is convenience." Daniel's confident expression faltered for the first time. You always did enjoy moral speeches. Callum smiled politely. No, I simply believe that how someone treats people when they have nothing to gain tells us everything we need to know. An uneasy silence settled over the group. Daniel glanced at Marin one last time before turning away with Lydia, but the damage had already been done. Guests who had watched the exchange no longer whispered about the woman abandoned at the altar. Instead, they quietly discussed the difference between two men who had responded to the same situation in completely different ways. As the orchestra resumed playing, Marin looked toward Callum with growing admiration. He had never insulted Daniel, never raised his voice, and never embarrassed her. Somehow, by choosing dignity instead of revenge, he had protected her far more completely than any dramatic confrontation ever could. The days following the gala unfolded with a quiet rhythm that neither Marin nor Callum had expected. Newspapers gradually shifted their attention toward the upcoming merger, and for the first time since the failed wedding, Marin could walk through downtown Chicago without feeling every stranger's eyes following her. She spent her mornings transforming the unused studio at the estate into a creative workspace, pinning fabric samples, architectural sketches, and color palettes across large design boards. One afternoon, Callum stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He paused just inside the doorway, careful not to disturb her concentration. I hope I am not interrupting. Marin smiled without looking away from the blueprints spread across the drafting table. Only if you dislike seeing organized chaos. He quietly set 1 cup beside her. I have seen board meetings with far more confusion. She laughed, surprising even herself. It was the first genuine laugh she had shared in weeks, and Callum noticed it immediately, although he said nothing. Instead, he wandered slowly through the studio, studying framed sketches leaning against the walls. His attention stopped at a watercolor rendering of a neighborhood community center filled with natural light and open gathering spaces. Did you design this? He asked. Marin nodded. Years ago. It never became a real project. It should. She shrugged gently. The client canceled after cutting the budget. Callum continued looking at the painting longer than she expected. People always underestimate what beautiful spaces can do for ordinary lives. His answer caught her attention because it sounded deeply personal rather than polite. Before she could ask what he meant, his assistant appeared at the door carrying a thick folder. Sir, the investors from Seattle have arrived early. Callum accepted the documents, but paused before leaving. Would you join us for dinner tonight? Marin smiled. As long as business stays in the boardroom. That is a promise. After he left, the assistant remained behind for a moment, organizing papers that had slipped from the folder. One worn photograph accidentally slid onto the floor near Marin's feet. She instinctively picked it up before the assistant could react. The picture showed a much younger Callum standing inside what appeared to be a university architecture exhibition. Beside him stood several students proudly presenting scale models of sustainable housing. Marin frowned with curiosity. I did not know Mr. Ashford studied architecture. The assistant smiled warmly. He did not. He sponsored the exhibition every year. Marin looked more closely at the photograph. Near the center of the display stood a young woman holding an award certificate. Although the image was several years old, she immediately recognized herself. Her hair had been shorter then, and she looked younger, but there was no doubt. Shock crossed her face. This was my graduate exhibition. The assistant seemed surprised that she had not known. Mr. Ashford attended every year. He always said the most important innovations rarely came from the biggest firms. Before Marin could ask another question, the assistant realized she had spoken too freely and politely excused herself. The photograph remained in Marin's hands long after the door closed. That evening, during dinner on the terrace overlooking the lake, she quietly placed the old photograph beside Callum's plate. He looked at it for several seconds before exhaling softly. I wondered when you would find that. Marin searched his face. You were there. Yes. Years before I ever met Daniel. He nodded once. You won first place for community-centered residential design. You remember that? I remember everything about that afternoon. She stared at him in disbelief. Why? Callum looked toward the calm water before answering. Because your presentation was not about expensive buildings or luxury clients. You talked about giving dignity back to families through thoughtful design. Everyone else discussed profit. You discussed people. Marin remained speechless. After the ceremony, I asked one of the professors who you were. He admitted quietly. I considered offering you a position at Ashford Global's development division. But before I contacted you, I learned you had already accepted a role at Mercer Development. Her heart skipped. So all these years. He smiled gently, though there was unmistakable sadness behind it. I respected your choice. You looked happy, and I never believed another person's relationship was mine to interrupt. Marin lowered her eyes toward the photograph resting between them. Suddenly dozens of small moments made sense. His unusual knowledge of her work, his confidence in her character, even the careful way he had spoken to her on the day of the wedding. None of it had been coincidence. Callum had seen something in her long before she ever knew his name, and instead of pursuing her for his own happiness, he had quietly stepped aside because he believed her happiness mattered more than his own. 1 week later, the atmosphere inside Ashford Global shifted almost overnight. The merger that had seemed unstoppable suddenly faced unexpected resistance after several influential investors postponed their final approval meetings. Financial commentators speculated endlessly about the reason, but inside the executive offices, everyone knew Daniel Mercer had begun a relentless campaign to undermine Callum's credibility. Rumors spread through business circles that Ashford Global's chairman had become distracted by personal matters, while anonymous articles questioned whether his recent decisions were motivated by emotion rather than strategy. Callum ignored every headline with remarkable discipline. Each morning he walked into headquarters carrying the same leather briefcase, greeted every employee by name whenever possible, and focused entirely on the work ahead. Marin watched his quiet determination with growing admiration, but she also noticed the exhaustion hidden behind his calm smile. One afternoon, she arrived at the corporate headquarters to meet with the design team overseeing the renovation of several community development centers that Ashford Global had recently funded. As she stepped out of the elevator, conversations around the reception area suddenly became unusually quiet. Several employees looked away the moment they noticed her. Others offered polite smiles that disappeared almost instantly. Before she could understand why, a young marketing coordinator hurried toward her holding a tablet with visible hesitation. Miss Whitlock, I thought you should see this before the meeting. Marin accepted the device and opened the article displayed on the screen. Her heart immediately sank. Across the top appeared a sensational headline claiming that Callum Ashford had orchestrated his appearance at her failed wedding for publicity before convincing her to participate in a carefully planned public relations marriage. The article described her as an actress playing the role of a heartbroken bride while suggesting their entire relationship had been negotiated long before the ceremony. There was no evidence, only anonymous sources and carefully edited photographs designed to create doubt. Marin slowly lowered the tablet. People actually believe this. The coordinator looked genuinely apologetic. Some do. Before either of them could continue, another notification appeared. A popular financial commentator had published what he claimed was a leaked legal document proving Callum and Marin were preparing a contract marriage. The article did not contain the actual agreement, only selective details twisted into something manipulative and cynical. Within hours, the story spread across television networks and social media. By late afternoon, reporters surrounded the headquarters entrance, shouting questions every time an employee walked outside. Marin remained inside the conference room, staring silently through the glass wall as camera flashes reflected across the lobby. She felt the familiar weight of public judgment settling onto her shoulders once again. When Callum entered the room after finishing a board meeting, he immediately noticed the expression on her face. Without asking a single question, he understood. "You have seen it," he said quietly. She nodded. Someone knew about the contract. Callum remained calm. "Only a handful of people ever saw it. Does that mean someone betrayed you?" He gave a small shrug. "Possibly." Marin looked at him with growing concern. "This could damage the merger." "It could. Then why are you so calm?" He smiled gently. "Because panic has never solved a single problem." She looked away, struggling with the guilt rising inside her. "Maybe this is my fault. Ever since I came into your life." Callum interrupted her before she could finish. "No." His voice remained soft, but absolutely certain. "The responsibility belongs to the people spreading lies, never to the person being lied about." Those words almost brought tears to her eyes. That evening, after leaving the office through a private garage to avoid reporters, Marin insisted on stopping by her mother's house for a short visit. She needed somewhere that still felt ordinary. Her mother welcomed her with a warm embrace and homemade chicken soup, listening quietly as Marin described everything that had happened over the past week. When she finally finished, her mother smiled gently across the kitchen table. When someone spends more energy attacking another person's character than improving their own, they usually know they are losing. Marin thought about those words during the drive back to the estate. As the car entered the front gates, she noticed Callum standing alone on the terrace overlooking the lake, still wearing the same suit he had left the office an hours earlier. He had not even gone inside. She joined him in silence. After several moments, he spoke without taking his eyes off the water. Daniel is trying to force us into defending ourselves emotionally instead of thinking clearly. Marin folded her arms against the cool evening breeze. What happens if the board believes him? Callum finally turned toward her with quiet confidence. Then we stop explaining our intentions. He reached into his briefcase and removed the original cream-colored marriage agreement, placing it gently on the terrace table between them. We show them the truth instead. The following morning, every major news network carried the same announcement. At noon, Callum Ashford would address the media from the headquarters of Ashford Global. By 11 o'clock, the plaza outside the glass tower was overflowing with reporters, investors, employees, and curious onlookers hoping to witness another dramatic confrontation. Television crews adjusted cameras while commentators repeated endless speculation about secret contracts, corporate manipulation, and the future of the merger. Inside a private conference room, Marin stood beside the window watching the crowd gather below. She turned toward Callum, who calmly buttoned the jacket of his charcoal suit as though he were preparing for an ordinary business meeting. "You still have time to deny everything," she said quietly. "People would believe you." Callum smiled gently. "Perhaps for a day." He lifted the familiar cream-colored agreement from the conference table. But truth deserves something better than another temporary headline. She looked at the document that had once represented protection and necessity. "If you reveal it, everyone will know our arrangement was real." "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "They will also know exactly what it was." A few minutes later, they entered the auditorium together. Hundreds of camera flashes illuminated the stage as reporters shouted questions before Callum had even reached the podium. He waited patiently until the room settled into silence. "Good afternoon," he began. "For the past week, many stories have been written about Miss Marin Whitlock and me. Some have contained fragments of truth. Most have contained assumptions." He placed the agreement on the podium where every camera could see it. "This document is real." A wave of whispers swept through the audience. Commentators hurried to send breaking updates while photographers zoomed in on every page. Callum continued speaking with the same calm confidence that had first earned Marin's trust. "Several weeks ago, I offered Miss Whitlock a 1-year marriage agreement. I made that offer after witnessing her public humiliation and believing we could help protect each other from circumstances neither of us had created." Another reporter stood immediately. "So the rumors were true?" Callum nodded. "Partially." He slowly opened the agreement. "What the rumors failed to mention is that this contract guaranteed her independence, protected her career, respected her privacy, and allowed her complete freedom to leave whenever she wished. There were no financial rewards for remaining, no penalties for walking away, no conditions requiring affection or personal sacrifice." The room became noticeably quieter. Marin watched several journalists lower their phones as they listened instead of searching for another sensational quote. Callum looked toward her before continuing. "When I drafted this agreement, I believed respect could be written into legal language. I was wrong." He gently lifted the signed pages. "Respect is demonstrated by actions, not clauses." Without hesitation, he tore the agreement cleanly in half. The sound echoed through the silent auditorium. Then he tore the remaining pages again until the contract became nothing more than small pieces of paper resting in his hands. No one spoke. No one moved. Every camera remained fixed on the stage. Callum placed the torn pages into a small glass recycling container beside the podium. "As of this moment," he said calmly, "there is no agreement between us except honesty." A reporter immediately called out, "Mr. Ashford, are you saying your planned marriage is canceled?" Callum smiled for the first time that afternoon. "No." He turned fully toward Marin. "I am saying that if she ever chooses to marry me, it will never again be because of obligation, public image, or business strategy. Marin felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Yet for the first time since the disastrous wedding, she no longer felt trapped beneath public judgment. She saw only one man standing before her, willing to sacrifice a carefully prepared corporate strategy rather than allow people to question her dignity. Callum took one slow step closer. Years ago, I admired your work before I ever knew your name. Weeks ago, I admired your strength when the world watched you lose everything. Today, I admire your courage even more because you kept believing kindness was worth offering after kindness had not been returned to you. His voice remained steady, but the sincerity inside every word was unmistakable. I cannot promise a perfect life, Marin. I cannot promise that business will always be easy or that challenges will disappear. But I can promise that I will never ask you to become less than who you are so the world will approve of me. If you remain beside me, it will be because we choose each other freely. Tears gathered in Marin's eyes as she realized the greatest promise he had ever made contained no contract, no deadline, and no condition. It contained only the freedom she had nearly forgotten love was supposed to give. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Lake Michigan with the same quiet beauty that had greeted Marin on the day she first questioned whether she could ever trust another promise again. Only this time, everything felt different. The gardens surrounding the Ashford estate had been transformed with elegant white flowers, soft green accents, and simple wooden chairs arranged beneath towering oak trees. There were no extravagant displays meant to impress strangers, no endless rows of cameras, and no carefully staged spectacle designed for magazine covers. Instead, there were family members, close friends, longtime employees, and the people who had stood beside them when life had been at its most uncertain. Marin looked at her reflection one final time before stepping outside. Her gown was graceful rather than extravagant, and around her neck she wore the small silver necklace her mother had given her on her college graduation day. The wooden jewelry box that had once held a painful engagement ring now contained something entirely different. Resting inside were the torn pieces of the old marriage agreement, carefully preserved as a reminder that the strongest relationships were built only after fear had been left behind. Her mother gently squeezed her hand. "You are smiling differently today." Marin nodded with tears shining in her eyes. "Because today I am walking towards someone who never asked me to become someone else." Across the garden, Callum waited beneath a canopy of white roses, dressed in a classic black suit with the same calm expression he seemed to carry through every season of life. Yet anyone who knew him could see the difference. The guarded businessman who had once believed responsibility always came before happiness had finally allowed himself to hope. As the music began, Marin slowly walked down the garden path. This time there were no whispers of doubt, no curious reporters searching for another scandal, and no fear waiting at the end of the aisle. Every step felt lighter than the last because she was walking toward a future she had freely chosen. When she reached him, Callum quietly took both of her hands without hesitation. "Last year," he said softly enough that only she could hear, "I watched you lose everything you thought your future would be." Marin smiled through happy tears. "And somehow I found something far better." The officiant welcomed everyone before inviting them to exchange their vows. Callum looked directly into her eyes. "I cannot promise that life will always be simple. There will be difficult days, unexpected disappointments, and moments when the world asks more from us than we think we can give. But I promise that you will never face those moments alone. I will always choose honesty over convenience, respect over pride, and us over every headline the world could ever write." Marin gently laughed as a tear rolled down her cheek. "I once believed love was measured by beautiful words. Then I met someone who proved love is measured by quiet actions repeated every single day. You gave me space when I needed healing, confidence when I doubted myself, and kindness without asking for anything in return. Today I choose you for exactly the same reason I will choose you tomorrow, because beside you I have never needed to earn my worth." The rings were exchanged beneath warm sunlight filtering through the trees. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, joyful applause echoed across the gardens. Callum leaned forward and kissed her forehead before embracing her, and laughter filled the air as flower petals drifted gently around them. During the reception, the chairman of the Ashford Global Board quietly announced that the merger had become the most successful in company history, while Marin's community design initiative had already transformed neighborhoods across 3 states. Together, they had built more than thriving careers. They had created places where families could gather, children could play, and hope could quietly return to communities that had been forgotten for too long. Later that evening, as the celebration faded into the soft glow of string lights, Callum led Marin to the small studio overlooking the lake where she had first begun believing in herself again. Hanging above the entrance was a simple bronze plaque engraved with just a few words: the Marin Whitlock Community Design Institute. She covered her mouth in surprise as he handed her the keys. "It is yours," he said, "not because you are my wife, but because you earned it long before we ever met." Marin wrapped her arms around him, overwhelmed by gratitude. As they stood together watching the sun disappear beyond the water, she finally understood that the greatest rival in her story had never been another businessman. It had been fear itself, the fear of trusting again, the fear of beginning again, and the fear that kindness would only lead to heartbreak. In the end, those fears lost, because real love never demanded perfection, wealth, or even perfect timing. It simply arrived through quiet integrity, stayed through unwavering respect, and transformed 2 lonely lives into one extraordinary future. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.